My husband took everything in the divorce. I smiled and said, "Thank you." I know how that sounds. Trust me. 3 weeks ago, I sat in that Austin courthouse, 34 years old, and signed away the 5-bedroom house, both luxury cars, and the entire commercial real estate company everyone thought he'd built alone. His lawyer was practically vibrating with victory. His mother, Patricia, was smirking from the second row like she'd orchestrated world peace. And his mistress, Brittany, actually took a selfie near the courthouse steps, already planning her Instagram takeover of my former life. Vincent looked at me like he'd just won the lottery. That same confident, controlling expression I'd seen for 8 years. The one that said I was disposable, forgettable, just the wife who couldn't keep up. The truth everyone was about to discover. That smile wasn't defeat. It was 47 seconds away from the most shocking reversal any of them would ever witness, because buried in page 47 of that 73-page agreement was a clause that would transfer every dollar of his hidden debts directly onto his shoulders. I couldn't believe how perfectly the trap was working, how they'd all underestimated the backstabbed wife who'd been documenting fraud, forgery, and financial betrayal while playing the role of broken woman. What started as instinctive awareness when I found those documents slowly became 3 years of quiet, methodical documentation. The first discovery happened that day in his office. But the most deliberate 9 months came after I'd already started building my case, when the trahison became public and I knew the endgame was close. They humiliated me, mocked my worth, cheated me out of dignity, and I let them, because karma was hiding in the fine print, and revenge tastes best when they never see it coming. Then the judge's gavel hit. Vincent signed that waiver, and exactly 47 seconds later, his face drained of every drop of color when his own lawyer finally read what he'd agreed to. What happened next wasn't just payback. It was justice, reclaimed one strategic decision at a time. Let me take you back to where this really began, because you need to understand how completely I'd been erased before I could fight back. Vincent and I got married when I was 26, fresh out of grad school, and he was this confident, ambitious guy who seemed to have everything figured out, the kind of man who walks into a room and owns it. We bought this gorgeous 5-bedroom house in Austin, drove matching luxury cars, and he ran a commercial real estate firm that looked impressive on paper and even better at dinner parties. From the outside, we were the couple people whispered about with admiration, the ones who made it before 30, but inside those walls I was slowly disappearing. He controlled everything, every bank account, every credit card, every password to every email, and he'd say things like, "You focus on making our home beautiful, babe. I'll handle the boring money stuff." I didn't realize I was being erased until it was almost too late, until I was just the smiling wife who hosted brunches and pretended everything was fine. Then Tyler came into our lives, and suddenly I had a reason to wake up that went beyond maintaining appearances. My son became my entire world, this tiny human who needed me in ways that felt real and urgent. And for the first time in years, I felt like I mattered. But Vincent barely showed up. Late to bedtime, missing soccer games, always closing deals or networking at events I wasn't invited to anymore. The humiliation started creeping in slowly, the way he'd introduce me as just my wife instead of by name. The way he'd make financial decisions without even pretending to ask my opinion. I remember standing in Tyler's nursery one night, holding my sleeping son, and feeling this ache in my chest that I couldn't name yet. It wasn't anger, not quite. It was the realization that I'd given someone complete control over my dignity, and he was using it to make me smaller every single day. That ache would eventually turn into something much sharper, something that wouldn't let me stay silent forever. Everything changed the day I opened the wrong drawer looking for Tyler's birth certificate for school enrollment. I was in Vincent's home office, a space I rarely entered because he'd made it clear it was his domain, and I pulled open this heavy wooden drawer expecting files and documents. Instead, I found a graveyard of secrets. Bank notices printed on that aggressive red paper, collection letters, final warnings from creditors, and statements showing debts I'd never heard him mention. My hands started shaking as I flipped through them, seeing amounts that made my stomach drop, seeing my name forged on loan applications I never signed, seeing this empire of lies he'd built while I smiled for family photos. The truth hit me like cold water. We weren't rich, we were drowning, and he'd been using my identity as a life raft while letting me believe I was just the grateful wife. I didn't confront him that day, didn't scream or cry or demand explanations, because something shifted in me right there in that office. I took out my phone, photographed every single document, and felt myself go cold and calculating in a way I'd never experienced before. For the next 6 months, I became someone I barely recognized, someone patient, strategic, and completely silent about what I knew. I started meeting with Rachel, this sharp-eyed woman at our bank who became my first ally, and she looked at my copied documents and went pale. She explained how Vincent had forged my signature on business loans, how he'd listed me as co-signer on debts that could destroy my credit and future, how the whole financial structure was built on fraud and desperation. Rachel helped me open a separate account at a different bank under my maiden name, somewhere Vincent's control couldn't reach, and I started moving tiny amounts of money there. $20 here, $50 there, whatever I could skim from grocery budgets and cashback transactions. Every document I found, I photographed. Every suspicious email I could access, I forwarded to a secret address. Every lie he told at dinner, I wrote down with dates and details. I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. I was building a case brick by brick, and the vengeance I felt wasn't hot and explosive. It was ice-cold and architectural. I knew confronting him would give him time to cover tracks, to manipulate, to turn this around on me like he'd turned everything else around on me for years. The public betrayal came 9 months after I'd started my secret documentation, and it was so blatant it almost felt like he wanted to humiliate me. Vincent showed up to his company's anniversary dinner with Brittany, this 26-year-old marketing associate with perfect hair and that confident laugh of someone who's never been lied to yet. He introduced her as his business partner, but the way his hand rested on her lower back told the whole room a different story, and I watched our entire social circle choose sides in real time. My mother-in-law, Patricia, cornered me near the bathroom and said, "Maybe if you'd kept yourself up better, Vincent wouldn't need to look elsewhere." And I felt something inside me just shut off. The family drama exploded from there. Suddenly, I wasn't invited to Sunday dinners. Mutual friends stopped returning calls, and I'd hear whispers at Tyler's school pickup about how I'd let myself go and couldn't keep my husband happy. But here's what they didn't see. I wasn't fighting back because I was already 10 steps ahead, already building something they couldn't imagine. And their mockery was just giving me more time to prepare the most sophisticated payback any of them would ever witness. The divorce demand came on a Tuesday morning, delivered not with tenderness or even basic human decency, but with cold calculation and a lawyer's letterhead. Vincent walked into the kitchen where I was making Tyler's lunch, dropped a manila envelope on the counter, and said, "I want everything. The house, both cars, the business, all assets. You can have custody of Tyler since you're so obsessed with being a mom anyway." The way he said it, like he was doing me this huge favor by letting me keep our son, made my blood run cold. But I kept my face neutral, kept my hands steady as I finished cutting sandwiches. He wanted me to break down, to beg, to make this dramatic so he could paint me as the unstable ex-wife in whatever narrative he was building with Brittany. Instead, I looked at him and said, "I need time to process this. Can we meet with lawyers next week?" The confusion that flickered across his face was delicious. He'd expected tears, rage, desperate negotiation, but I gave him nothing except compliance. That's when I knew he'd fallen into the trap, because he thought my silence meant defeat, when really it meant I was about to reclaim every single piece of dignity he'd stolen. I called Margaret Chen that same afternoon. This divorce attorney Rachel from the bank had recommended, someone who specialized in complex financial cases with hidden assets and fraud components. Margaret was in her 50s, had silver hair she wore in this sharp bob, and eyes that could read a balance sheet the way some people read poetry. I walked into her office with years of documentation, photographs, bank statements, forged loan applications, email chains, text messages, everything I'd collected from that first discovery in his office through those 9 months of deliberate investigation. She spread them across her conference table like puzzle pieces, and after 2 hours of review, she looked up at me with something like respect. "Your husband wants everything? Let's give it to him. All of it, including every dollar of debt he's been hiding." That's when she explained the strategy that would become my justice. If Vincent insisted on taking all marital assets, he could also assume all marital liabilities, especially the ones with his forged signatures and fraudulent applications. We'd bury the debt assumption clause deep in a 70-page agreement, make it technical and boring, and count on his arrogance to skip the fine print. The pressure campaign started immediately, this coordinated attack designed to make me cave faster and accept whatever crumbs they offered. Brittany started calling me directly, her voice dripping with fake concern, saying things like, "Vincent's really stressed about this dragging out. Maybe you could just sign quickly so everyone can move on." His mother showed up at my temporary apartment unannounced, pushing past me into the living room and declaring that I was embarrassing the family by not handling this gracefully. Vincent himself sent emails that walked the line between threatening and pleading, reminding me about the mortgage payments, about Tyler's school tuition, about how difficult he could make custody arrangements if I didn't cooperate. Every message, every call, every manipulation attempt went straight into Margaret's files. More evidence of the campaign to humiliate and control me. But I played my part perfectly. I was the defeated wife, the one who'd lost the fight, the one who just wanted it over. I let them see exactly what they wanted to see. A woman who'd been backstabbed and broken, too tired to fight back, ready to surrender everything just to escape. The family meeting they staged 2 weeks before court was psychological warfare disguised as mediation, and I walked in knowing it was all theater. Patricia had organized it at her house, with Vincent's siblings and their spouses filling the living room like a jury, and Brittany actually had the audacity to sit beside Vincent on the main couch, playing house with my soon-to-be ex-husband. They took turns explaining why I should be reasonable, why fighting would only hurt Tyler, why I should think about my son's stability and just sign whatever Vincent's lawyer had prepared. His brother Mark actually said, "Look, you're not equipped to handle business affairs anyway. Vincent built that company, not you." The shaming was relentless, wave after wave of family members telling me I wasn't enough, hadn't contributed enough, should be grateful Vincent was even offering me anything. I sat there with my hands folded, nodding occasionally, letting them think they'd won, while inside I was counting days until they'd all watch this confidence crumble. The self-worth they tried to strip from me in that living room was already mine again, hidden in Margaret's briefcase and waiting for the perfect moment to emerge. Margaret, my divorce attorney, worked 12-hour days crafting what she called the most beautifully boring divorce agreement in Texas legal history. 73 pages of dense legal language, property transfers, and asset distributions. Page 47 contained the clause that would change everything. A single paragraph stating that upon accepting full ownership of all marital assets, Vincent would also assume full responsibility for all marital debts, including but not limited to business loans, lines of credit, and any financial obligations contracted during the marriage, regardless of whose signature appeared on original documents. The genius was in how it was written: technical, dry, nested between clauses about furniture division and retirement account splits, easy to miss if you weren't reading carefully. The clause wasn't hidden or illegal, it was just technical and boring, exactly the kind of thing Vincent's arrogance would make him skip right over. Margaret also included a waiver of financial audit clause on page 61, giving Vincent the option to skip the lengthy asset verification process if he was confident in his understanding of the marital estate. She looked at me after finalizing the draft and said, "Men like your husband don't read contracts. They skim for the dollar signs and their names in bold. His ego will do our work for us." We were betting everything on his arrogance, on that same controlling confidence that had convinced him he was smarter than everyone else in every room. The week before court, I prepared Tyler for changes without giving him the full truth, because 7-year-olds shouldn't carry adult burdens. I explained that Daddy and I were going to live in different houses, that it didn't mean anyone loved him less, that sometimes adults had to make hard choices to keep everyone safe and healthy. He asked if it was because of Dad's new friend Brittany, and my heart cracked a little because kids see more than we think. I kept my voice steady and said, "It's complicated, baby, but Mommy's making sure we're going to be okay, better than okay." Those nights were hard, sitting in our small rented apartment after putting Tyler to bed, wondering if I'd miscalculated, if Vincent would somehow smell the trap, if this whole plan would backfire and leave me with nothing. But then I'd remember his face at that anniversary dinner, the way he'd looked at me like I was disposable furniture, the way Patricia had mocked me in public, the way Brittany had taken that courthouse selfie like she'd won some prize. The infidelity hurt, sure, but the systematic humiliation hurt more, and that's what needed answering. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the narrative, proving I was never the weak, defeated woman they'd tried to make me believe I was. The courthouse on divorce day was this old building in downtown Austin with marble floors that echoed every footstep, making the whole morning feel like some kind of dramatic countdown. I arrived 30 minutes early with Margaret, both of us in conservative navy suits, and we sat on a bench outside the courtroom reviewing the agreement one last time. Vincent showed up 20 minutes late with his lawyer, Brittany hanging on his arm like an accessory, and Patricia trailing behind them wearing this triumphant expression that made my stomach turn. They didn't just come to finalize a divorce. They came to celebrate a victory, to watch me sign away my life while they collected trophies. Brittany was wearing designer sunglasses indoors and kept checking her phone, probably already planning the Instagram post about her new life in my old house. Vincent looked at me across the hallway with this smug confidence, and I forced myself to look away, to appear small and defeated, because I needed him to walk into that courtroom believing he'd already won. The karma was so close I could taste it, but first I had to let him feel absolutely certain he'd destroyed me. Inside the courtroom, the judge was this no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Judge Morrison, who'd apparently seen every divorce trick in the book and had zero patience for theatrics. Vincent's lawyer stood up first and summarized their position. "Your Honor, the parties have reached an agreement. Mrs. Haley Mitchell will retain primary custody of the minor child, and Mr. Vincent Mitchell will assume ownership of all marital assets, including the primary residence, 2 vehicles, and Mitchell Commercial Properties, LLC. The way he said it sounded so clean, so simple, like they were just dividing furniture, and nobody was losing their entire material existence. Margaret stood next and added, "The agreement is comprehensive, Your Honor. 73 pages that detail every asset, every debt, and every obligation. My client is prepared to sign today if Mr. A. Mitchell has reviewed and accepted all terms." Judge Morrison asked Vincent directly, "Have you read this entire agreement, Mr. Mitchell?" And I watched him hesitate for just a fraction of a second before his lawyer whispered something, and Vincent said, "Yes, Your Honor, I have." That lie would cost him everything, but he didn't know it yet. The signing ceremony felt like it lasted both seconds and hours. This surreal moment where I put my name on document after document, officially transferring the house where I'd raised my son, the cars I'd driven to 1,000 errands, the business I'd supported through dinner parties and networking events. Brittany actually leaned forward in her seat like she was watching a proposal, this sick excitement radiating off her, and Patricia dabbed at fake tears while smiling like she'd orchestrated world peace. Vincent signed with this flourish, this big, confident signature that seemed to claim ownership not just of property, but of the whole victory. When we got to the financial audit waiver on page 61, his lawyer started to say something, but Vincent cut him off. "We don't need an audit. I know what I own." Margaret and I exchanged the briefest glance, and I had to physically bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Judge Morrison declared the agreement binding, stamped the final page, and said, "Mr. Mitchell, you now assume full ownership and responsibility for all assets and liabilities detailed in this contract. Congratulations on your property." The word liabilities hung in the air for a moment, But Vincent was already standing up, already shaking his lawyer's hand, already turning to Brittany with this victorious grin. 47 seconds after Judge Morrison's gavel hit the bench, Vincent's lawyer finally reached page 47 of the agreement, and I watched the color drain from his face in real time. He grabbed Vincent's arm and pulled him into the hallway, and through the courtroom's glass doors, I could see him frantically pointing at the document, his mouth moving rapidly, Vincent's expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to rage. Margaret calmly packed her briefcase and said, 3, 2, 1. And right on cue, Vincent burst back into the courtroom, slamming the agreement on the table and shouting, "This is fraud! She tricked me!" Judge Morrison's expression went from neutral to ice-cold in seconds, and she said, "Mr. Mitchell, you confirmed under oath that you read this document. Are you now admitting you lied to this court?" The shocking moment of watching him realize he'd been caught, watching him understand that his arrogance had just cost him everything, was worth every sleepless night I'd spent planning this. His lawyer tried to salvage it, arguing about hidden clauses and unreasonable terms, but Margaret calmly presented Vincent's own emails demanding everything and his waiver of the audit process. Judge Morrison took exactly 4 minutes to review the debt clause and the waiver, and then she delivered the verdict that would echo through Vincent's life for years. "Mr. Mitchell, you insisted on taking all marital assets without financial review, and you signed a waiver acknowledging you understood the terms. The agreement clearly states you assume all associated debts and financial obligations. This court finds no fraud, no deception, only your choice not to read what you signed." The justice in that moment was so pure it almost hurt, watching Vincent's entire world collapse while Brittany stood in the corner with her phone out, no longer smiling, no longer taking selfies. Patricia tried to interrupt, but the judge shut her down with one raised hand, and I felt this wave of dignity wash over me, this reclaiming of every piece of self-worth they'd tried to strip away. Vincent turned to me with such rage in his eyes and said, "You destroyed me." And I looked back at him with complete calm and replied, "No, Vincent. I just gave you exactly what you asked for. All of it." Margaret guided me out of the courthouse while Vincent's lawyer desperately tried to file emergency motions that would go nowhere, and on the steps where Brittany had taken that selfie 3 weeks ago, I finally let myself breathe. The implosion started within hours, faster than even Margaret had predicted, because the debt Vincent had assumed wasn't just substantial, it was catastrophic. By that evening, creditors who'd been waiting for legal clarity started calling his phone, sending notices to the house, filing collection claims now that he was the sole owner of record. Brittany called me at 9 p.m., her voice shaking, saying she didn't know about the debts and asking if I'd planned this whole thing, and I told her, "You wanted Vincent and everything that came with him. Now you have it. Congratulations." She blocked me after that, and through mutual acquaintances, I heard she'd moved out within 48 hours, abandoning whatever fantasy she'd built about playing house in my former life. Patricia called Margaret trying to negotiate, trying to find some loophole, insisting her son had been manipulated, and demanding the agreement be voided. But Margaret shut her down professionally. "Your son demanded every asset without review. He got exactly what he demanded. Tell him to hire a bankruptcy attorney." The backstabbed feeling Vincent had given me for years was finally his to carry, and I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. The karma continued unfolding in waves over the next 6 months, each one more devastating than the last, and I watched it from a distance with something that wasn't quite satisfaction. More like the quiet relief of finally letting go of someone else's consequences. The house, that 5-bedroom showpiece in Austin that Vincent had insisted on taking, went on the market within 2 months because it couldn't cover even half the outstanding debts. I heard through a former neighbor that he'd listed it 15% below market value, desperate for a quick sale, and it still sat empty for weeks because word travels fast in real estate circles about properties tied to fraud investigations. His luxury car got repossessed on a Tuesday morning right outside Mitchell Commercial Properties, and apparently clients were there when the tow truck arrived. Nothing destroys a commercial real estate CEO's credibility faster than watching his car get hooked up while he's showing multi-million-dollar properties. The business itself started hemorrhaging clients once the debt news spread, because nobody wants to invest with someone drowning in financial chaos they'd hidden from their own wife. Vincent went from CEO with a corner office to a commission-based sales associate at a competitor's firm within 4 months, and the payback wasn't even that I'd orchestrated it. It was that I'd simply stopped protecting him from himself. Brittany's exit from the situation was almost as satisfying as Vincent's downfall, though in a different way. She represented all the women who'd looked at me with pity, who'd thought they were smarter or prettier or more deserving. She lasted exactly 11 days after discovering the full scope of the debt. 11 days of Vincent trying to convince her they could rebuild together, and her realizing she'd traded an affair's excitement for a bankrupt partner's reality. I heard she went back to her parents' house in Dallas and told people she'd been deceived and didn't know he was married, despite photos of her at family events where I was clearly present. The lies people tell themselves to avoid accountability are fascinating, but I didn't have energy for her anymore. She'd been a symptom, not the disease. What mattered more was Tyler asking me one afternoon why Dad's friend didn't come around anymore, and me explaining gently that sometimes people aren't ready for the consequences of their choices. At 7 years old, he didn't need the full truth, but I wouldn't lie to him either. I'd watched too many lies destroy too much to start that pattern with my son. Patricia's humiliation was perhaps the most poetic, because she'd built her entire identity around her son's success and superiority, and watching that crumble left her scrambling for a new narrative. She tried calling me 3 times in the weeks after court, each voicemail progressively more desperate, first demanding I fix this situation, then asking if we could work something out for Tyler's sake, and finally just crying about how the family was falling apart. I didn't return any of the calls, didn't engage with the manipulation, because I'd learned that the best revenge against someone who tried to shame you into silence is simply refusing to participate in their drama anymore. Through Vincent's sister, who'd been one of the few family members who hadn't attacked me during the divorce, I heard Patricia had stopped hosting Sunday dinners, stopped bragging about her successful son, essentially retreated from the social circles where she'd once held court. The truth was that her son's fall exposed her own complicity in his behavior, and people were quietly reassessing every time she'd excused his controlling tendencies or mocked my contributions. Dignity, I was learning, couldn't be taken from you permanently, only temporarily, and only if you agreed to stay small. Financial recovery for Vincent was basically impossible given the scale of debts and the fraud allegations hanging over his professional reputation. Margaret kept me updated occasionally, not because I asked, but because she said she'd never seen a more complete legal implosion from someone's own arrogance. The business loans I'd found in that drawer, the ones with my forged signature, all transferred to his sole responsibility. That was roughly $847,000 in commercial debt. The house, which sold eventually for $580,000, barely covered the remaining mortgage and left nothing for the second mortgage he'd taken out secretly. The cars were both leased, not owned, another lie he'd told to maintain appearances, so repossession didn't even dent the debt. He tried filing bankruptcy twice, but the fraud components complicated everything, and creditors fought hard because they knew he'd deliberately hidden assets and manipulated documents. At one point, his lawyer contacted Margaret asking if I'd be willing to testify that I'd known about the debts before the divorce, trying to create some narrative where I was complicit. But I had years of documentation proving I'd discovered and documented everything without his knowledge, from that first day in his office through every month of silent investigation that followed. The shocking thing wasn't that he fell, it was how far, how completely, how irreversibly. I want to be clear about something important. I didn't celebrate Vincent's destruction, didn't throw parties or toast his losses, because that would have meant I was still letting him control my emotional energy. What I felt was something quieter and deeper, a release, like I'd been holding my breath for years and could finally exhale. Tyler asked me one night why I seemed lighter, and I told him, because Mommy doesn't have to worry about things that weren't her fault anymore. That simple truth carried more weight than any revenge fantasy. I'd spent years absorbing Vincent's chaos, covering for his lies, shrinking myself to make his ego seem bigger. And all of that ended the moment Judge Morrison stamped our agreement. He wanted everything. He got everything, including every consequence he'd been deferring through manipulation and control. The infidelity hurt, the betrayal stung, but the real damage had been the systematic erosion of my sense of self. And getting that back, reclaiming my own judgment and worth, mattered infinitely more than watching him lose houses and cars. The unexpected part was how quickly I stopped thinking about Vincent at all, how rapidly he became just a legal obligation and co-parent rather than the center of my mental universe. Margaret told me most of her clients stay emotionally entangled with their exes for years, replaying arguments, tracking their lives, needing updates on their struggles or successes. But I found myself genuinely indifferent. I didn't check his social media, didn't ask mutual friends for gossip, didn't drive past his new apartment or calculate his financial situation. Someone who'd once defined my entire world became just someone Tyler visited every other weekend under court-ordered arrangements. The karma I'd needed had happened. The justice I'd demanded had been served, and continuing to care would have just been another way of staying trapped. Dignity meant moving forward, not looking back. And every morning I woke up in our small but peaceful apartment felt like proof that I'd chosen the right path, even when it had looked like surrender. Rebuilding my life started with the smallest, most practical decisions, like choosing paint colors for Tyler's room in our 2-bedroom apartment and realizing nobody would question my choices or call them too expensive or impractical. I'd taken a job at a nonprofit housing organization 3 months before the divorce finalized, entry-level work that paid a fraction of what Vincent used to bring home, but felt honest and mine in ways our old life never had. My boss, Jennifer, was this straightforward woman in her 40s who'd survived her own messy divorce and recognized recovery when she saw it. She didn't ask invasive questions about my past, just evaluated my work, and when I stayed late organizing a fundraiser that brought in 30% more than projected, she called me into her office and said, "You're wasted in this position. I'm recommending you for the program director role." The promotion came with a raise, actual benefits I controlled, and this sudden realization that competence had always been inside me. Vincent had just convinced me it didn't matter without his name attached. Tyler adjusted to our new life faster than I'd expected, showing me that kids are resilient when they have one stable, honest parent. Our apartment was tiny compared to the 5-bedroom house, but he said he liked it better because it feels cozy and you smile more now, Mom. That observation, delivered while we were making frozen pizzas because I was still learning to cook without catering budgets, hit me harder than any of Vincent's old criticisms. We established routines, movie nights on Fridays, farmers market on Saturday mornings, homework at the kitchen table where I could help instead of being shut out of the important spaces. His grades actually improved. His teacher commented on how much lighter he seemed, and when he drew a family picture in art class, it showed just the two of us with a big son and his dog from the old house that Vincent had rehomed without asking. Kids process trauma through what they don't say as much as what they do, and watching Tyler reclaim his childhood security was worth every asset I'd signed away. The self-worth I'd been rebuilding wasn't just mine. It was creating space for him to build his own. I enrolled in a professional certification program for nonprofit management, something I'd wanted to do years ago before Vincent convinced me it was impractical, and we didn't need 2 careers. Sitting in those evening classes after putting Tyler to bed, surrounded by other women and men reinventing themselves, I felt this expansion happening inside me. One of my classmates, Maria, was recovering from her own family drama, and we'd study together at coffee shops, swapping stories that weren't about revenge, but about reclaiming competence. She said something once that stuck with me. They try to convince us we're nothing without them, and then act shocked when we leave and become everything they feared. The truth of that hit different because I hadn't just survived Vincent's betrayal. I'd documented it, strategized through it, and dismantled his power structure from the inside. That wasn't weakness or victimhood. That was strength I'd always had but had been trained not to recognize. The financial recovery was slow but steady, built on a budget I actually understood and controlled. I opened credit cards in my name only, built my score back up from the damage Vincent's fraud had done, and started a small emergency fund that grew by tiny increments but felt like a mountain of security. No more mysterious bills, no more wondering why bank statements didn't make sense, no more having to ask permission to buy groceries or school supplies. Rachel from the bank, the woman who'd first helped me understand the extent of Vincent's fraud, sent me a card on my first-year anniversary of leaving. "You protected yourself when nobody else would. That's not revenge. That's survival strategy." I kept that card in my desk drawer and looked at it sometimes when I felt overwhelmed, when the apartment's water heater broke, or Tyler needed unexpected medical care, because it reminded me that I'd already survived the worst thing and everything else was just logistics. The social rebuilding was harder than the financial, because divorce cleaves friend groups and forces everyone to choose sides whether they want to or not. Some people I'd considered close friends disappeared entirely, clearly believing Vincent's version of events where I'd trapped him with hidden debts and manipulated the legal system. Others reached out tentatively, curious but cautious, and I found myself not wanting to relitigate the past with people who hadn't stood by me when it mattered. But new friendships emerged, other single parents at Tyler's school, women from my certification program, neighbors in the apartment complex who'd watched me move in with just essentials and helped carry boxes without judgment. These connections felt different, built on present reality rather than past performance, and I learned to value quality over quantity. Someone who brings you coffee when you're drowning in project deadlines means more than 10 people who liked your Instagram posts from the old house, but vanished when things got real. Dating felt impossible and irrelevant in equal measure, because the idea of trusting someone with emotional intimacy again seemed like volunteering for pain. Jennifer, my boss at the nonprofit, tried setting me up once with her brother-in-law, this perfectly nice accountant who took me to dinner and asked thoughtful questions. But halfway through the meal, I realized I was still in survival mode, still cataloging exits and calculating worst-case scenarios. I wasn't ready, might not be ready for years, and that had to be okay. The cheating and infidelity Vincent had inflicted wasn't just about physical betrayal. It was about demolishing the basic trust that human beings won't deliberately hurt you when you're vulnerable. Rebuilding that trust would take time, maybe therapy, definitely more healing than I'd accomplished in just 1 year. For now, Tyler and I were enough. 2 people figuring out how to be happy without someone else's chaos shaping our days, and that felt like victory enough. The call came on a random Wednesday afternoon, 14 months after the divorce finalized, while I was reviewing grant applications in my office at work. My phone showed Vincent on the caller ID, and my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail because court-ordered communication was supposed to go through the co-parenting app we'd been mandated to use. But something made me answer. Maybe curiosity about what emergency could possibly require direct contact. His voice on the line sounded different, quieter, less certain, stripped of that commanding tone he'd wielded like a weapon throughout our marriage. "Haley, I need to talk to you about Tyler. Not about custody or logistics, just, I need to talk." The humiliation in his voice was unmistakable, but so was something that might have been genuine regret. And against my better judgment, I agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop the next morning. Margaret's voice echoed in my head. "Document everything, bring backup, never meet alone." But I was tired of living in defensive crouch, and sometimes you have to take calculated risks to move forward. Vincent looked like he'd aged 5 years in the 14 months since court, sitting in that coffee shop wearing a rumpled button-down instead of his usual designer suits. He'd lost weight, had new lines around his eyes, and kept his hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was anchoring him to reality. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a minute before he said, "I've been in therapy for 6 months. Court mandated it first for the visitation arrangement, but I kept going because I needed to understand how I became someone who could do what I did." The shocking thing wasn't that he was in therapy. It was that he was admitting he'd done something wrong, something that needed understanding rather than excusing. I didn't respond immediately, just watched him struggle for words, because I'd learned that silence creates space for truth that comfort sometimes prevents. Eventually, he continued, "I blamed you for everything when really I was blaming you for not saving me from myself. The debts, the lying, the control. That was all me, and you just stopped covering for it." He wanted to see Tyler more regularly, wanted to rebuild what he called an actual relationship instead of court-ordered hours, and he understood that decision wasn't his to make unilaterally anymore. I listened to his whole pitch: the therapy progress, the financial counseling he was getting, the stable apartment he'd maintained for 8 months, the steady job that wasn't glamorous but was honest. Part of me wanted to say no purely on principle, to make him feel the backstabbed isolation he'd inflicted on me. But that impulse came from old pain rather than present reality. Tyler deserved a father who was trying, even if that father had catastrophically failed before. But I wasn't going to be naive either, wasn't going to let hope override protective instinct. "Vincent, I believe you're trying. I even hope you succeed. But Tyler's stability matters more than your redemption arc, and you don't get to practice parenting on his emotional security." The conditions I laid out were firm and non-negotiable, delivered in the same calm tone I'd used when signing away everything in that courtroom. First, he had to provide documentation from his therapist that he was attending regularly and working specifically on controlling behaviors and emotional regulation. Second, financial stability had to be proven with 6 months of consistent employment records and rent payments. I wouldn't have Tyler in chaotic living situations while Vincent figured his life out. Third, all visitations stayed supervised through the court-approved program until his therapist and mine both agreed he'd made sufficient progress. Fourth, zero contact with Brittany or anyone else who'd participated in the humiliation campaign, because I wouldn't expose Tyler to people who'd shown such disrespect for basic human dignity. And fifth, he had to acknowledge in writing what he'd done, not for my benefit, but so there was documented accountability that Tyler could read someday when he was old enough to understand. The justice I needed now wasn't revenge, it was boundaries. Vincent agreed to everything without argument, which honestly surprised me more than anything else about the conversation. He said, "I'm not asking for forgiveness or expecting you to forget. I'm asking for a chance to be someone Tyler doesn't have to apologize for when he's an adult." That particular phrasing hit something real, because it showed he'd thought beyond his own needs to long-term consequences, to the kind of damage that echoes through generations if not addressed. We set up a structure. He'd email progress reports monthly through the co-parenting app, I'd review with my therapist, and we'd reassess supervised visitation after 6 months if all conditions were met. It wasn't trust. Trust was probably destroyed permanently. But it was cautious, boundaried willingness to let him prove change was real. Margaret, my divorce attorney, reviewed the written agreement I drafted afterward and said, "This is exactly how you protect yourself and Tyler while still leaving room for redemption. You're not his savior, but you're not his executioner either." Tyler's response when I explained that Dad wanted to see him more was complicated and honest in the way only 7-year-olds can be. Will he yell less? Can I tell him when I'm sad? Those questions revealed so much about what our old life had been. Vincent's explosive anger, the emotional suppression we'd all performed to keep peace, the fear of expressing normal human feelings. I promised Tyler that if Dad was really doing the work, those things would change. And if they didn't, we'd protect him from it. We role-played scenarios, what to do if he felt uncomfortable, how to express needs, what boundaries looked like even with parents. The self-worth I'd rebuilt in myself now extended to teaching my son he didn't have to shrink for anyone's comfort, not even his father's. This wasn't about giving Vincent another chance to betray us. It was about showing Tyler that people can change, that accountability matters, and that you can enforce boundaries without becoming bitter. The reclaiming wasn't just about me anymore. It was about breaking cycles. So here's what I need you to understand. What I really need you to hear beneath this entire story. Vengeance isn't always loud or immediate or satisfying in the ways movies make it seem. Sometimes justice looks like patience, like documentation, like playing a role so convincingly that your opponents lower their guard and hand you the weapons to dismantle them. I didn't win because I was crueler or smarter than Vincent. I won because I stopped protecting him from consequences and started protecting myself and Tyler from his chaos. The betrayal taught me that silence can be strategy, that being underestimated gives you time to prepare, and that dignity isn't something anyone can take from you permanently, only temporarily, and only if you agree to stay small. Now I want to hear from you, because I know I'm not the only one who's lived some version of this story. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's arrogance became their downfall? Where you had to choose between immediate confrontation and strategic patience? Maybe you're in the middle of your own family drama right now, trying to figure out whether to fight back or document and wait. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done differently? What surprised you most about this story? And if you've been through betrayal or infidelity or someone systematically humiliating you, how did you reclaim your self-worth? I'm not just asking for engagement. I genuinely want to build a community here where we share these experiences, where we stop pretending everything's fine and start talking about the real, messy, complicated work of rebuilding after someone tries to destroy you. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this channel isn't about surface-level drama or clickbait. It's about the truth nobody wants to say out loud until they've lived it. I'm going to keep sharing stories about family betrayal, justice, and the shocking ways people reveal who they really are when they think nobody's watching. You deserve content that treats you like an intelligent adult who can handle complexity, who wants depth instead of easy answers. Let's keep this conversation going, because every time someone shares their story, they give permission for someone else to stop suffering in silence. You're not alone in this. None of us are. And sometimes just knowing that makes all the difference.